Hello and welcome to Learning Centers Part 1. My name is Jennifer Fowler and I am literacy coach, English teacher, and ed professions teacher at Greenway High School. The presentation that I'm going to go over today has been created and updated by a variety of literacy coaches. So your local literacy coach is a great reference or resource when you are thinking about learning centers and starting to create learning centers for your own classroom. And you can also get in contact with me if you have any questions or concerns about learning centers after this presentation. So today we're going to be going over the most important aspects connected to learning centers. We're going to define what a learning center is, talk about some of the benefits, when we might use them, how to manage that behavior, and we're going to give you some ideas about how to do learning centers in your own classroom. So when you want to get in shape, you might join a circuit training program like a CrossFit. And at these programs, you are doing a variety of exercises, and it's broken up into smaller time sections. And it's like this because it makes it more manageable for you, and you might see more results because of the way that the exercise is set up. Stations in the classroom are similar to this. So what is a learning center? A learning center is a self-contained sections of the classroom in which students engage in independent and self-directed learning activities. By independent, we mean that this is the part where the students are working mainly without the teacher's assistance. They may still be working in a group or in partners. In fact, they will be within stations, but the teacher is now kind of letting kids do things on their own. They're not up in front of the room talking. We're beyond the guided practice. The kids are kind of doing now. Learning centers also provide easy access to a variety of learning material in an interesting and productive manner. The key words here is that there's variety, that is interesting, and that makes students more productive because of the variety and the fact that it's interesting. So learning centers are also called stations. I actually use the word station more often than not, so you will kind of hear me use those centers, stations interchangeably. And they are small teams working on short time tasks. And oftentimes there's about 8 different tasks that students can work on within their teams. They're going to rotate to these different tasks. So again, it's just like that circuit training. It's just academic circuit training. So it's circuit training for students' minds as opposed to their bodies. It's giving them small tasks that they do that are timed and making it more manageable for the students because they have those more small tasks and it's more engaging. So thinking back to your education classes, you might remember the name Vygotsky, and he talked about how learning occurs best when novices collaborate and converse with more experienced and more knowledgeable others in a shared task. So in this case, a novice might be a student who maybe is struggling a little bit more, and then we put them with a student who maybe is a little bit more experienced in what we're doing, and that helps learning occur for both of them, actually. And these shared tasks are the tasks that they're going to be doing within a station. Vygotsky's big thing is that learning is a social process, and stations provide opportunities for students to learn socially and have good academic discussion and discourse. Research also talks about that learning results when collaboration between students and teachers is accompanied by discussion. Instructional activities are meaningfully connected to students' prior experience and knowledge, and instruction is conversational. So just like Vygotsky, it's that learning. There needs to be talking to have that learning. And again, stations give an opportunity for students to have meaningful activities that can be connected to what they already know, some prior experience. And then stations provide them also an opportunity to talk and converse and be social with each other. So some more center benefits. They're great for when you want to review skills. So I found that I really loved using stations for PBA review or any test review. A lot of times in the past, I would stand up there and just be talking to the students as a review. And now I do stations with them as a review, and they are doing instead of me just sitting and talking. And I can hit a lot of skills in a small amount of time. So they're great for a review, or if I've given them something and I see that, man, they're really struggling with these parts, which is a little bit after the practice PBA, I can see where I need to remediate before the actual PBA, and then I can create stations that really focus on what needs to be remediated with the students. And so stations are great for that. It also gives teachers an opportunity to work in a small group at one of the stations. So teachers can be a station themselves, and they're working with just individuals or a couple of kids as opposed to having to hit the whole classroom. This is very similar to what they would do in Read 180 or in our math labs. Is students are given the opportunity to talk with the teacher in a much smaller setting. Students, let's face it, these are teenagers. They have short attention spans a lot of times. Heck, we as adults have short attention spans. So stations give students the opportunity. It fits perfectly in with those short attention spans, and that makes it more engaging for students because they get up, they get moving, they're having different activities that they're doing. That whole like every 7 minutes, we're supposed to change it up. Stations fit perfectly into that. And again, the students are doing the work, so they are very student-centered. Some other benefits of stations is that you can differentiate the learning. The stations can be differentiated, so maybe one station is a little bit lower level, another station is a little bit higher level, and the kids are working in their groups together to make sure that everybody within their groups can accomplish each station. Or you can actually differentiate within the station. So at one station, you might have a lower level, a medium level, and a higher level activity, and the kids can take it upon themselves to determine which activity fits their needs and what they can do. So there's a couple different ways to differentiate learning, and it makes differentiation a little bit easier when you have it in station format. Again, we've already talked about collaborative learning is important for students, and it's just something different. Like I said, with my old reviews for my PBA would be me standing up, just talking to the students, and that's just boring. And now we do stations, and the kids get up every 10 minutes and are going to a new station. It just mixes it up. It gives us both a different change of pace. And you can also have lots of opportunities to blend your learning. So stations can be all old school, where it's pen and paper that you're having them do, or it can be all tech, or it can be a combination of both. It just depends on what your needs are as the teacher and what your students' needs are as the learner. So we're going to take a quick brain break. Go ahead and in the Edpuzzle answer this question. Although popular in primary grades, why might high school teachers generally refrain from learning centers? So another important aspect to think about when thinking about centers or stations is, when do I use them? You're not going to use this to teach, essentially. You're not going to use this for that whole group instruction. It's going to come after. Now, it can come in the we do part, but it fits best in the you do part. So the we do is, yes, pairs and small group, but a lot of times in the we do, the teacher is really still guiding them. We're still having a lot of that guided practice in there. And I am still going to be around in the you do part. I'm not just going to go to my desk and sit back while the kids are rotating between stations, but I'm doing a little bit less than I would do in the we do than I would do in the you do. So that's why stations fit best in the you do. You could use them for the we do, depending on how you set them up. But the best part of a lesson to have stations in is the you do part. Okay. Again, they can be used to review, deepen practice, to differentiate, to remediate, and to build any background knowledge. That's a fun way to start. Let's say if I was going to be reading Romeo and Juliet, I could start with a couple stations that maybe build some background knowledge about Shakespeare, about the time, and they could do some activities to give them some background knowledge before we begin reading the actual text. So I was at a conference one day, and I'm sitting in a conference. It's a stations session, and this lady's talking about stations, and I'm like, okay. And up until that point, I hadn't really used them because I always had a really hard time coming up with 8 stations. And in classes that we have, 30 to 40 students, we need 8 stations so that there is 3 to 5 students in each state at each station. So I just always shied away from them because I could not think of 8 stations. And I'm listening to this lady present, and she said, use grocery store lines. And I said, well, what's that, right? And she explained that grocery store lines are when you set up your classroom essentially kind of in a line. I can't do that in my classroom, but it's similar. And the kids, you divide your class in half. And so you create teams 1 through 4. They're on one half of your class. And you create teams 5 through 8. They're on the other half of the class. And team 1 through 4 is going to go through station 1 through 4. And then you're going to have the same stations on the other half of your class that are, again, stations 1 through 4. So you're creating 2 sets of the same station so that you only are having to create 4 stations instead of 8. And this was like, light bulb, how had I not ever thought about this before? It's pretty easy to come up with 4 stations, a lot easier than it is to come up with 8. And so when you divide your classroom this way, so team 1 through 4 is staying on one side of the class. They're never going to the other side of the class. They're only doing those stations on that are on that side of the classroom. And teams 5 through 8 are staying on the other side of the classroom. They're never coming to the other side. But those stations are all the same. They're all getting the same information. And it was just such an aha moment for me. I'm like, this is why this lady has a PhD and I don't, because apparently she could think of this and I did not. But it just really helped me be able to jump into stations after that because it didn't seem so difficult to come up with 4 stations as opposed to 8. So using the grocery store line method has really benefited me in my classroom in the use of stations. So stations don't all have to be in one day. It totally depends on what your schedule looks like and what activities you are having your students do. So if you are having your students, if you want to get stations done in one day, you need to have shorter activities, maybe about 10 minutes per station. That's about 44 minutes total. That gives you some 5 minutes at the beginning of the hour for directions and gives you time for students to rotate in between. If you want them to do activities that take a little bit longer, you can take more than one day to do your stations. The students just need to remember what station they left off at and who their groups were. These activities, then you can make the center 15 to 20 minutes, depending on what the topic is. It doesn't even have to take 2 full days. Maybe you need to just take the first 20 minutes of the next day to finish up 1 or 2 stations. Any of that is fine. You have that freedom as the teacher. And it really depends on what you're doing with the stations, will depend on how long they need to be. So I do a Bloom's Taxonomy and Objective one, which you'll see an example of that next PowerPoint. And in that one, it does take the kids a little bit longer. It's Bloom's is very difficult for them to understand. Objective writing is very difficult for them to understand. So I need to give them a little bit more time. Those stations take 2 days. I plan 2 days. I know they're going to take longer. But stations in my English classroom, I can always, most of the time, get them done in a day. It just totally depends on what is at each station. So when thinking about stations, you want to choose a focus and how you're going to have a work arrangement. So by focus, this is kind of the general idea that you want to base your stations on. So you might decide you want a vocab station and a writing focus station and a discussion focus and a reading focus. So you're varying the focuses. This is kind of again, that general idea. And then I'm going to get more specific when I actually start to plan out my stations. But I kind of want to choose the focuses first. And then at each of those, once I figure out my focus, then I got to figure out how are the kids going to be working within that station. So they don't always have to work with their entire group at each station. You can have them partner up at a station. They might be working with me. They might be working on themselves by themselves at a station. So you've got to decide first what the focus is, what's the general idea that you're going to base that station on, then how are they going to be working, and then you're going to have the more specific logistics between there. So it's important to know what a learning center is not. It is not taking your worksheet and dividing it up into 4 stations. This is not showing variety. This is not engaging to the students. Yes, it might get them up and moving, but remember the benefits of learning centers is that you can differentiate, that you're creating variety for students, you're engaging them more, and by just dividing up a worksheet, you're not doing that. Okay, we're going to take a little bit of time to reflect. So answer the question on Edpuzzle using the sentence frames that I have here for you. Side note, sentence frames are great if you want to include them in answers to questions that students might have within a station. So what stood out to you so far? What question do you have? What can you relate to? Choose one of those and answer it in your Edpuzzle. So often teachers are worried about stations because you're afraid that the students won't stay on task, or that it's going to be pure chaos, or how do you keep them doing what you want? And that's just like with anything else, you just have to really manage that behavior. The biggest thing, and I feel like this for any classroom setting, is that you need to practice procedures beforehand. Kids have to understand how you want them to get into their grooves, how you want them to rotate. I have it even down to how they move their desks if I need them to move their desk, how they pick up their chairs, how quickly they should rotate. A lot of times I'll give them a countdown of you're going to have 10 seconds to get to your next station, depending on how far the station is from them. So really having those procedures so that students understand what is expected of them, just like anything else that we do in teaching. It's important to try to do things that students have done before, especially when you first use stations. That will help eliminate some of those confusions and questions that they might have. And so if you throw something new at them, it's going to be more difficult in this new kind of setting. But a lot of times I'll do something like an attack the text at a station. And my students have done that so many times before that they know how to do that with no questions asked. So give them tasks that they've done before. It's important to try to hold kids accountable by having them write down or type something for each center. And that's each kid. I don't let them do that as a group. They each are going to write down something at each center to hold themselves accountable. Sometimes some centers might be quicker than other centers. So you want to make sure that you have some sort of enrichment activities for them to do, or some kids may finish something faster than other kids at the center. So it's always important to maybe have something else for them to do if they finish up that station before everybody else. Really big thing, if you're using a website or app, make sure that students have already logged in, or that's all taken care of, that they've used that app before. So that they're not wasting time on that process of it, getting logged in and all that. Obviously, plan for misbehavior. For kids not doing what you want them to do, then what are you going to do with them? Know beforehand, before you start your stations. Really think about how you're grouping students. Obviously, you don't want a group of all best friends together because they're probably not going to stay on task more than likely. Or you might need to have various levels of where students are in each team. So really be strategic about how you put groups together. You want to, tell kids that stay within their own group. Don't be, talking to other groups or trying to get your friend's attention that's in another group, to really just focus on their own group. And really focus on that positive behavior at first, and then maybe give them some incentives like participation points for following the expectations, or maybe even a class competition for bonus points, as to which the class has the fewest misbehaviors during the stations, they get the most points. There's different ways to hold kids, to incentivize students in this setting. It's also helpful to make sure that they know the time. You can put the timer up on the smart board so that they can see the countdown. I usually give them a 1-minute warning because sometimes they get into what they're working on and they're not looking at the timer. And it just helps them really figure out where they're at in the station, and they don't have enough time to get in trouble because they're trying to finish up the activity beforehand, before it's time to rotate. So we're always concerned about work, and if I have 4 to 6 to 8 stations, that seems like a lot of grading for each kid. But you can a lot of times figure out which stations are the most, give you the most bang for the buck, essentially, and that will tell you the most about how the kid did overall. And choose that station and grade that station. Just grade one. You don't have to grade all of them, or just give them participation points. If you while you were monitoring, you saw that most kids were doing what they were supposed to be doing, glance over the work, make sure it's done, and give them points for it. But if there's something that you really want to be able to give them feedback on, then choose the one that's most important, or maybe 2 that's most important, and just grade those instead of grading all of them. Okay, some more helpful tips, like we talked about prioritize that management, especially the first few times. Give them those participation points, etc. If you, the teacher, are going to be part of a station, then more than likely you want to put that station in the middle of the class where you can kind of keep an eye on everybody, or in your own classroom, wherever that peak place is in your classroom that you can watch everybody. You want to put your station there so that you can monitor as you are teaching. One thing that I absolutely do before I start, before I start the stations is I definitely go over each direction for each station and how to rotate before we start. And then I even have the kids like parrot back. I'll call on kids and ask them like, okay, what are we doing at station 1? What are we doing at station 2? Just to make sure that they all understand, and I clear up any questions they might have at the beginning before we start. I also have the directions written at each station. And if I'm using the computer, I also have them usually on Classroom online for them. So the directions, I've gone over them, they're at each station, and they're online more than likely. So students should know what's going on at each station. And I also have one student, when they get to a new station, just quickly volunteer to read the directions again so that everybody is on the same page. When students have completed work, you can decide if you want them to carry the work with them, and then turn it all in once you're done with all stations, or they can leave it on the table. I've done both. I have one set of stations where I use folders, so kids will just put the completed work in a folder at the station before they move. I've had other times where I've had a handout the students are filling out, and that's what I'll collect at the end. Most recently, I've mostly had each bit of information I want them to do is on Classroom, all under one assignment. And so they would just turn in that whole assignment, and I will show you what that looks like in my second PowerPoint. So it's just really up to you how you want them to do it, and it may just depend on what they're doing at each station as well. And then there's always the kids that aren't going to finish, and even though their group might have finished, there may be a kid that just didn't have enough time to, or there may be a group that they just had a very robust conversation and they didn't get to finish it up, or there may be reasons why kids did not finish a station. And so it's important to give them time either at the end of the hour or the next day, or they can come in after school to finish up whatever stations they're struggling with or they haven't completed. So the biggest thing with stations is just to try them. Like, just don't be afraid to try them. Just go do it and figure it out as you go, and you'll make corrections. I mean, the first time I did stations, they weren't the best. And the more and more I've done them, I've gotten better at them, just like with anything else. And if you really want to, again, bounce ideas off of somebody, or you think you might want to try stations, but you're a little nervous and you just want to see if somebody else has some better ideas, please reach out to your local literacy coaches. They would be more than happy to help you implement stations within your classroom. Thanks, guys. Part 2 is coming.